All right, everybody, welcome back to another reading hour. This will be the reading hour for August 5th, 2025. All right, so let's pick it back up on the Gladio book. So this next section here is an untimely audit. So much money pouring out of the country into mysterious offshore companies with weird sounding names didn't go unnoticed. In June 1978, a 12-man team from the Bank of Italy launched a probe of Banco Ambrosiano, only to only to discover that they had wandered into a bewildering labyrinth of shady financial transactions. So remember yesterday I had described like Roberto Calvi's money laundering scheme as like when you hide a file on a computer by just putting it in so many folders that no one would ever bother to look for it. It's like once technology makes it easy to uncover such things and just search for something, that's not necessarily what happened here, but literally just the most basic of looking into it. Calvi refused to provide the team with requested information concerning the 8 companies that had received hundreds of millions in loans, or about the branches of the bank in Luxembourg, Nassau, and Managua. He claimed that such disclosures would breach the banking regulations of other countries. Eventually, the team asked for more investigators to unravel the puzzle. But even 20 auditors poring over the books day after day for 6 months could not discern the true nature of the subsidiaries and shell companies, let alone the ground plan of the financial scheme. That's crazy too. Like he was able to make this so complicated that even people whose literal job this is to look into these things, to decipher these financial documents, they couldn't do it, and they also couldn't seem to figure out the motive. It's like, how do you actually operate this financial scheme? Because that's the whole idea: is you have to be one level ahead of the people that are looking into your books, because you need to actually keep track of your own financial transactions, right? You need to keep track of where your money is going to and to whom it's going. Uh, So how do you do that so that you can decipher, but then these regulators cannot? Again, unless they're just like incentivized in some way not to understand it. On November 17th, 1978, the examiners produced a 500-page report that was painfully abstruse. But the overall verdict that the bank was, quote, not at all satisfactory in its operations sent shivers throughout Italy's financial community. The auditors added this recommendation, quote, there is a clear need to cut back the network of subsidiaries which Ambrosiano has created abroad. They, meaning the bank officials, must also be forced to provide more information and figures about their real assets to avoid the risk that a possible liquidity crisis on their part might also affect the Italian banks with all the unfavorable consequences that might entail. Hmm. So they're literally seeing that they're creating so much fictitious capital, so much money out of nowhere, and they have so many like entire institutions that are based on this fictitious credit that it could actually result in this collapse of the entire Italian banking system, kind of like the 2008 housing crisis. The report devoted more than 25 pages to the tortuous relationship between Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank. It stated, quote, independently of its position as stockholder, the IOR is bound by strong interest connections to the Ambrosiano Group, as is demonstrated by the Vatican's, constant presence in some of Ambrosiano's most meaningful and delicate operations. Okay, so like, despite whatever distance is claimed to be between Banco Ambrosiano and the Vatican Bank itself, the way that the Vatican Bank micromanages Banco Ambrosiano shows that that is not the case. This next section here is a warning to the Pope. When the news of the report was leaked to the public, shares of Ambrosiano fell 30% on the Milan exchange, and a horde of panicked depositors descended on the once Stead Bank to withdraw their savings. The findings garnered the attention of the financial police, who opted to take a closer look at the books of Banco Ambrosiano and the dealings of Roberto Calvi. The new investigation, headed by Judge Luca Mucci, prompted Calvi to move the base of his international operations even deeper within the heart of Latin America. In 1980, he opened Banco Ambrosiano de America del Sud in Buenos Aires. As soon as the new investigation got underway, Beniamino Andreatta, Italy's treasury minister, met with Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, the Vatican Secretary of State, to urge the severance of all ties between the Holy See and Calvi. Okay, so he's saying, like, basically, this is not going to look good for you guys if you're associated with Roberto Calvi and Banco Ambrosiano. The scandal's about to be blown open, so you should try to get ahead of it and distance yourself now. I mean, good advice. Casaroli presented these concerns to the Holy Father, but so much money was pouring into the IOR in solidarity that John Paul II opted to ignore the warning. Yeah, making too much money. The next section here is called Setbacks. Matters beyond the control of Calvi, the CIA, and the Vatican also served to undermine the shell game. Throughout 1979, interest rates throughout the world soared to astronomical heights, making it more expensive for Banco Ambrosiano to obtain money for the loans. The Ambrosiano officials, prompted by the nagging concerns of board member Roberto Orson and deputy chairman Roberto Rizzone, began to demand definite proof from Calvi that the Vatican maintained control over the 8 ghost companies. The situation worsened as the dollar rose sharply against the lira, diminishing the worth of the lira-denominated bank shares. In July 1980, after the Guardia di Finanza uncovered evidence of, quote, illegal capital exportation, bank documentation, forgery, and fraud, Judge Mucci ordered Calvi to surrender his passport and warned him that criminal charges would be on the way. The banker was not amused. He needed his passport. He needed to meet with the oil-rich Arabs to secure a bailout. Thanks to the intervention of Gelli and leading members of P2 who provided bribes to Ugo Zaletti and other members of the Superior Court of the Magistrature, Calvi managed to recover his passport, just in time to travel to Nassau, where he forged a link between Ambrosiano overseas and Artak, a leading financial institution of the Arab world. Okay. So yeah, he's got to like pad his nest. He's got to feather his nest beforehand so that he has got some nice soft cushion to land on after whatever consequences actually come his way for all these financial misdealings. Let's see. I just wanted to look over something in this past paragraph. The situation worsened as the dollar rose sharply against the lira. So the money that they're holding, since it's all even fictitious to begin with, since they created loans based off of fictitious money that was never even there, and then paid no interest on that, but then used the loans to re-enrich themselves in that like vicious cycle we talked about yesterday. Let's see. Yeah, undermines the shell game. Yeah, it certainly does undermine your financial holdings if you're like discrediting the currency you're holding it in. A temporary agreement between the two firms was signed in London. Calvi now believed that his hope for salvation would come from the Muslim world. His faith was misplaced. The millions never materialized. Aw, womp womp. This next section here is the unanswered letter. On January 21st, 1981, a group of Milanese shareholders in Banco Ambrosiano feared that the balloon would burst and their shares would be worthless. Fearing that the balloon would burst, they wrote a long letter to John Paul II, urging him to investigate the unholy ties between Marcinkus, Calvi, Umberto Ortolani, Gelli, and the huge flow of cash into the corporations under the, quote, patronage of the Vatican. The letter, which was written in Polish so that the Pope could easily understand it, stated the following, quote, the IOR is not only a shareholder in Banco Ambrosiano, but also an associate and partner of Roberto Calvi. It is revealed by a growing number of court cases that Calvi stands today astride one of the main crossroads of the most degenerate Freemasonry, P2, and of mafia circles, as a result of inheriting Sindona's mantle. This has been done once again with the involvement of people generously nurtured and cared for by the Vatican, such as Ortolani, who moved between the Vatican and powerful groups in the international underworld. So again, you have to wonder how much of this is actually news to the Pope, though. Appalling effrontery. This is next section here. John Paul II neglected to give the shareholders the dignity of a response. Instead, in a gesture of cold indifference to their pleas, the Pope elevated Marcinkus to the position of president of the Pontifical Commission for the state of Vatican City. This position made, quote, the gorilla the governor of Vatican City, in addition to the head of the IOR. So, okay, it's safe to say at this point, he was like obviously in on it, and he's like, I hear your concerns, I see you, but I'm going to continue on with this anyway because I'm making a fuck ton of money. The promotion was made on September 28th, 1981, the third anniversary of the death of John Paul I. Regarding this, quote, appalling effrontery, author David Yallop wrote, through his Lithuanian origins, his continual espousal in fiscal terms of Poland's needs, and his close proximity to the Pope because of his role as personal bodyguard and overseer of all security on foreign trips, Marcinkus had discovered in the person of Karol Wojtyła the most powerful protector a Vatican employee could have. Yeah, so the gorilla played his cards right. He bribed the right people. He made the right connections. He is as secure as he could possibly be. Sindona, Calvi, and others like them are, according to the Vatican, wicked men who have deceived naive, trusting priests. Either Marcinkus has misled, lied to, and suppressed the truth from Pope John Paul II since October 1978, or the present Pope also stands indicted. Yeah, duh. Yeah, obviously. The elevation of Marcinkus was made despite the warnings from Italy's Treasury Minister, the Bank of Italy audit, the worsening financial condition of the shell companies, and the circulation of the P2 list, which showed that, quote, the gorilla remained a Freemason in violation of canon law. Yeah, remember, it's like you get excommunicated from the church if you're found to be a Freemason. Like, the two are supposed to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a member of the Catholic Church, a member of like the Vatican High Council and all these positions that they're in, and also be a high-ranking Freemason. Like, they're totally against the law of like each other. Like, I guess it's Freemasons don't care if you're a Catholic, but the Catholics definitely don't want you to be a Freemason. They say you're going to hell. So these people who, again, are professed like supposedly very religious, devout dudes, do not care about their immortal souls if they can make a bunch of money from the P2 Lodge in the meantime. Very obvious from their actions. So, why John Paul would make such a promotion at this stage in his pontificate defies all rules of logic, let alone moral rectitude. Again, just like being a Freemason and saying, yeah, I don't care if I go to hell, while supposedly being religious. One must realize that the Pope, not less than common layman, was aware that Marcinkus was a principal player in the billion-dollar counterfeit securities scam, the collapse of Banca Privata, P2 and the strategy of tension, the Aldo Moro affair, and the mysterious death of his predecessor. So the Pope must also, yeah, realize, or I guess the Pope hopefully realizes, but we also realize that those were all scandals these people were taking part in. The real post-mortem miracle of John Paul II remains the continual concealment of his complicity in high crimes from the legion of men and women of good faith who have proclaimed him a saint. Yeah, it's really, that's what they're describing. It's like very obvious that he was complicit, and people just don't seem to get it. No exit is the next section here. In late January 1981, the Italian government, at the urging of the Bank of Italy, established new regulations governing foreign interests held by Italian banks. Tight restrictions were now in place for foreign holding companies of financial institutions that were not banks. Such companies would only be allowed if their activities could be scrutinized by the Bank of Italy and if they operated in countries with a proper system of transparency. No names were mentioned in the new regulations, but the references to Ambrosiano couldn't be clearer. Within the Vatican, the Pope had responded to his plight with a demand for increased aid to Solidarity. This is the organization they have set up in Poland to give them money. Within P2, Jelly's reply was a request for $80 million from the shell game to purchase more Exocet missiles for the Argentines. Within the U.S. intelligence community, the CIA's answer was a call to Calvi for an increase in cash and munitions to combat the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. The Ambrosiano bankers stood on the brink of personal and financial ruin. The game had persisted too long and the stakes had become too high. The total debt for Ambrosiano hovered at $1.75 billion. It was a debt that no one, including the Vicar of Christ, opted to acknowledge, let alone, let alone pay. Yeah, the formatting's a little weird. Sorry. So now we're on to chapter 14, starting with the section "Desperate Don." It was understandable that this most energetic of popes, John Paul II, had prevaricated about taking on the Curia. There were so many aspects to the problem. Careerism and promotion were all important, with every seminarian determined to become a bishop. To move up the ladder required finding a protector. It also required embracing, quote, the 5 don'ts. Don't think. If you think, don't speak. If you speak, don't write. If you think, and if you speak, and if you write, don't sign your name. If you think, and if you speak, and if you write, and if you sign your name, don't be surprised. Hilarious. Funny how many things that probably applies to even in like the private world. Moving up the ladder with the help of a protector also frequently required participating in an active homosexual relationship. Oh, great, cool. Estimates of practicing homosexuals in the Vatican ranged from 20 to over 50%. The village also housed factions including sects of Opus Dei members and Freemasons and fascists. The latter could be found particularly among priests, bishops, and cardinals from Latin America. David Yallop, The Power and the Glory. This is, I guess, a quote from that book. David Yallop, The Power and the Glory. So that was the author we mentioned in the last chapter. As soon as the noose began to tighten around Calvi's neck, Michele Sindona left his suite at the Hotel Pierre and walked to the Tudor Hotel on the corner of 42nd Street and 2nd Avenue, where he met Rosario Spatola. The two men drove to Concadoro Motel on Staten Island, where Sindona donned a white wig, glued yellow chicken skin to his nose, and changed into a garish yellow suit. He packed a shoulder bag containing files and a list of 500 names of P2 members in prominent positions and headed off to Kennedy Airport, where he boarded a plane for Vienna with a passport bearing the name Joseph Bonamico. The passport had been provided to him by Johnny and Rosario Gambino. The date was August 2nd, 1979. It was time for the Don to get out of town. His fight to stay out of prison had failed. He was on $3 million bail and was obliged to report daily to the U.S. Marshal's office at 500 Pearl Street. His appeals for help to David Kennedy, Richard Nixon, U.S. Ambassador John Volpe, and CIA officials had gone unanswered. Sindona knew he had to return to Italy in order to gather support for his forthcoming trial in Manhattan. But there was a problem. He already had been sentenced to 3.5 years imprisonment in Italy and was wanted on a host of new charges, including the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli. He had no option except to stage his own kidnapping. Wild. This is wild stuff. This is like some of the most entertaining shit so far. Upon arriving in Vienna, Sindona was met by several of his P2 brothers and escorted to Palermo, where he came under the care of Joseph Miceli Crimi, the mysterious American-Italian plastic surgeon. Johnny Gambino, Rosario Spatola, and Vincenzo Spatola soon joined the former Vatican banker in Sicily. For the duration of their stay, Johnny never left his Don's side. Day after day, he would whisk Sindona away in a black Mercedes for conversations lasting 7 or 8 hours, and then take him to the Charlestown in downtown Palermo for dinner. Okay. So they're hatching all the plans, I guess. Delegating all the responsibilities. Let's see how far I am. I'll continue with this for like 3 more minutes. So the ransom note is the next section here. On August 9th, 1979, the press got word that Sindona had been kidnapped by the, quote, Proletarian Committee for the Aversion, of an Improved Justice. The ransom note followed with a demand of 30 billion lira for his release. If the money was not provided, the kidnappers were set to release the list of 500 names and assorted papers they had removed from the Don's shoulder bag. News of the list struck terror in the hearts of the Italian and American political leaders, industrialists, and military officials who had been engaged in heroin dealing, arms trafficking, money laundering, and a host of other nefarious activities with the man who, quote, had saved the lira. But the note was far more jarring to the CIA, since the assorted papers contained confidential memoranda outlining the celebrated mafiosi's long association with the agency. So a lot of powerful people are like actually scared that this made-up thing, the Proletarian Committee for the Aversion of an Improved Justice, that supposedly kidnapped the Sindona guy, that they will actually release these documents. It's like, you should know it's not a leftist org if they're asking for money and then withholding actual justice and accountability like that. It's like they would just release a list and kill the guy. Seems obvious to me. The Don's delusions. The Don had become delusional. He's a little delulu, folks. He believed that this threat would serve to restore him to his former position of power within the Vatican, the CIA, and the Italian financial community. The prison sentence, he believed, would be quashed, and all outstanding charges against him would be dropped. His Italian holdings would be returned to him, and U.S. officials would come forth to say that he was a noble figure who had spent his career fighting the advancement of the godless forces of communism. Sindona also remained delusional in his belief that U.S. military and intelligence officials, including Rear Admiral Max K. Morris and CIA Director Stansfield Turner, would come to his aid by telling the world that he had been engaged in an effort to make Sicily the 51st state, and that all legal action against him by the U.S. Department of Justice must come to an immediate end. Yeah, so he legit does have delusions of grandeur. That's exactly what that sounds like. The Master Calls is this next section here. As soon as he learned of Sindona's demands, Gelli summoned Dr. Miceli Crimi and Sindona to his villa in Arezzo, where he warned the fugitive Don of the dire consequences awaiting him if he broke his solemn vow to P2 by revealing anything about his Masonic brothers or violated the code of Omerta that bound him to the Sicilian men of respect. He would suffer an ignoble death. His image would be burned to ashes by his compatriots, and his family would not be spared from the wrath of his enemies. Sindona must return to the United States and face trial. Gelli would gain the intervention of the Holy Father on his behalf, and testimony would be provided that he had acted in accordance with the will of the Holy Mother Church and the forces of democracy. Duly chastised, Sindona acquiesced to the worshipful master's directives. Okay. So he basically comes and tells him, like, this is how it's going to go. Let me just set all your delusions to rest. This is what you got to do. And like a good boy, he does it. All right, so I'm going to switch over to the Western Marxism book. So again, this is Western Marxism by Domenico Losurdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. And from what I was reading yesterday, it seems like we're probably getting towards the end of this book. Oh, maybe not. We got 100 pages. My bad. We are on page 142 of 240. So, getting back to Zizek here, like we picked up on yesterday. In conclusion, Zizek's vision is not any different from the self-consciousness of the dominant classes in Europe and in the United States. The discovery of this convergence is not in itself a refutation of it. However, the refutation is provided by the Slovenian philosopher himself. He comments on the directive that Kissinger imparted to the CIA to destabilize Salvador Allende's Chile, quote, make the economy scream, and emphasizes how this same policy has continued to be used against Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. Zizek avoids, however, a question that imposes itself. Why would the Venezuela of Chavez and Maduro be considered more, quote, authoritarian than the country that tries by every means to destabilize it and subjugate it and that seeks to exercise its dictatorship over Latin America and over the world? Yeah, it's wild. Like, again, just the length that liberals, of course, but then even Western quote unquote Marxists will go to describe countries that the U.S. is antagonistic or hostile to, um, as being authoritarian, as being imperialist, as being anything like that you would actually use to describe the U.S. Again, these countries don't have 800 military bases. They don't have a globe-spanning financial empire with which they can levy sanctions on other nations and cause their entire country's population to suffer, such that they could maybe even get them to overthrow their own government. No other country has that kind of power. It's only the U.S. Certainly, from the point of view of the self-consciousness of the liberal West, the despotism exercised against the colonial peoples is irrelevant. Yeah, see? Based on this logic, on the occasion of his first inaugural address, Bill Clinton celebrated the United States as the oldest democracy in the world. No attention was given to the enslavement of blacks or to the expropriation, deportation, and decimation of the indigenous peoples. Zizek proceeds by a similar abstraction, a rather arbitrary one, in which he does not even ask whether the authoritarianism of Washington is not in some way the cause of the authoritarianism of Caracas. Mhm. We can make a general assessment here. It is quite strange to find a critic of capitalism who spares the worst aspects of this system, which are quite evident, according to Marx, in the colonies. A critic of waged work silent on forced labor would lack credibility. Yeah. But the history of forced labor in its many forms is, in large part, the history of colonial oppression. And it is without a doubt misleading for a critic of, quote, authoritarianism such as Zizek to invite us to pass over the authoritarianism enacted against peoples by a great power or by a coalition of powers who are subjected to devastating embargoes or bombardment and military occupation. Yeah, again, just what I was just saying. Like, you can't, you literally cannot overlook the fucking empire that is currently committing genocides, has concentration camps domestically, um, and has been, as we know now, like the overwhelming protector of fascism since the end of World War II. You can't overlook that and then just point at other countries and say they are this, they are that, they are fascist, they are authoritarian, they are illiberal. So this next section here is Zizek, the degradation of the anti-colonial revolution and the demonization of Mao. The lack of attention to the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism also emerges from the chapters of history described by the Slovenian philosopher. Of the revolution of the black slaves of Saint-Domingue and Haiti, he observes that it ended, quote, in regression into a new form of hierarchical rule, after the death of Dessalines in 1806. The observation is just if we look only at domestic politics. Internationally, the picture looks very different. Despite failing to find a stable form to transcend autocracy, the power of the ex-slaves continued to play a revolutionary role. It was Alexandra Pétion, a president of Haiti from 1806 to 1818, who got Simon Bolivar to commit himself to the immediate liberation of slaves in return for support of the struggle of Latin America for its independence from Spain. I did not know that. That's very interesting. Obstinately defending the institution of slavery was the, quote, Democratic Republic of North America, which, with a policy of embargo and naval blockade, sought to impose starvation or capitulation on Haiti, the country that, notwithstanding the despotism of its political regime, still embodied the cause of abolitionism and of freedom for blacks. To resort to the criterion that Zizek makes central for the reading of the present, we would have to say that Haiti represented, quote, authoritarian capitalism, while the United States represented more or less, quote, democratic capitalism. But this reading helps us understand very little of the present or the past, and indeed does violence to both. No less one sided is the judgment of the Slovenian philosopher on the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin. I will limit myself here to reproducing a lapidary condemnation. Quote, this is why Heidegger is wrong when he reduces the Holocaust to the industrial production of corpses. It was not that. Stalinist communism was that. Oh my god, is that really a quote from Zizek? That's terrible. Let's leave aside the taste for provocation by an author who sometimes prefers fireworks displays to arguments. That is a great burn on Zizek. That's very funny. This is not what is essential. We have seen eminent historians characterize Hitler's aggression in the East as the greatest colonial war of all time, a colonial war that, as we know, Stalin prepared for even before coming to power. So the least we can say is that the theorist of, quote, libertarian Western Marxism doesn't have an anti-colonialist bias. Just as he ignores the international role of Haiti, the embodiment of the cause of abolitionism notwithstanding its despotic regime, so he does not pay any attention to the international role of the Soviet Union of Stalin, which, frustrating the attempt by Hitler to reduce Eastern Europe to the, quote, German Indies, sounded the death knell for the world colonialist system, at least in its classical form. Yeah, again, you can't really talk fairly about Stalin or the USSR under Stalin unless you acknowledge that they were waging a war against the Nazis and then did win that war. Um, Pretty much all the other things that you would criticize them for pale in comparison to that. The pose Zizek assumes on another, more recent chapter of history, this time regarding China, is especially significant. Referring to the grave economic crisis and the terrible famine provoked or gravely exacerbated by the Great Leap Forward in 1958 to 59, he discusses with distracted disinterest, quote, Mao's ruthless decision to starve tens of millions to death in the late 1950s. Yeah, I guess Mao just woke up one day and felt a little, I don't know, he just felt froggy. You know, sometimes you feel froggy, you leap. He just felt like starving 50 million people for no reason. When for the first time I came across this statement, I was stunned. Was the Italian translation perhaps imprecise or too emphatic? Again, this is like Losurdo talking in Italian, that then gets translated into English here. Was the Italian translation perhaps imprecise or too emphatic? But no, the original English is unequivocal and even more chilling than the translated version. In the Italian, we find the phrase 10 million people, but the original has it as tens of millions. Probably the Italian translator had tried to safeguard the prestige of the author being translated, reducing the scale. In any case, we must acknowledge something. The recurring motif of the campaign committed to demonizing, together with the leader who exercised power in Beijing for more than a quarter of a century, the People's Republic of China itself, the republic founded by the greatest anti-colonialist revolution in history, such a motif is echoed without any critical caution by the most famous exponent of, quote, libertarian Western Marxism. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is probably the most scathing section he has on Zizek. He's essentially calling him the largest mouthpiece of the Western Marxists and describing how, in the same breath, describing how he is totally unserious in his interpretation of actually existing socialism and previously, historically existing socialism. However, the accusation does not find supporting evidence among the most serious authors. Even the Black Book of Communism, while insisting on the colossal proportions of the disaster, recognizes that, quote, undoubtedly it was not Mao's intention to kill so many of his compatriots. That's the Black Book of Communism is like the worst, least credible thing you could go to try and criticize the USSR, Mao's China. Like, there are so many kindergarten level debunks of this. It's amazing that anybody takes it seriously, but it just shows how far right indoctrinated most Westerners are. There also were eminent Western statesmen who refused to jump on the bandwagon of the incipient Cold War against the great Asian country. In an interview with the weekly Die Zeit, the German ex-chancellor Helmut Schmidt emphasizes the unintentional nature of the tragedy that the Great Leap Forward led to. Henry Kissinger also argued similarly. Certainly, it was, quote, one of the worst famines in human history. And yet, Mao sought to maximize the quote industrial and agricultural development of China, wanting to rapidly catch up to the West and therefore provide a widespread and generalized condition of well being. So, summing up, according to the illustrious US scholar and politician, Mao, quote, had once again called on the Chinese people to move a mountain, but this time the mountain did not move. Although marked by honesty and intellectual seriousness, the above mentioned positions are limited. They ignore the historical context in which the Great Leap Forward took place and which follows the long struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism. Anti-colonialism, sorry. We have already seen the concern expressed by Mao on the immediate eve of the proclamation of the People's Republic of China. The country, notwithstanding the glorious struggle for national liberation now concluded, risked being economically dependent on the United States and thus becoming a semi-colony. In effect, the Truman administration's directives were clear and merciless. Already in a desperate condition because of decades of war and civil war, the People's Republic of China, which was not admitted to the United Nations, was encircled and threatened militarily. Yeah, once again, like, I just have to always refer to the picture where they just put a map of all the U.S. military bases surrounding Russia, China, Iran, and they just make the same meme over and over again. They say, "Look how aggressive Russia or China or Iran is being. They put their country this close to all our military bases." Like, it's funny. It now had to be subjected to an economic war that would have brought it to a catastrophic economic situation, toward disaster and collapse. That would have provoked the political defeat of the Chinese Communist Party as well, which up to that moment had only governed more or less extended rural areas and therefore suffered from the total inexperience in the quote field of urban economics. It was this extreme economic fragility and potential fall into or return to the semi-colonial dependence that Mao sought to escape, making an appeal for a military-like mass mobilization of tens of millions of peasants who, despite being illiterate, through their revolutionary enthusiasm, would have brought about a prodigious acceleration of economic development. In reality, with his impatience and an inexperience in the quote field of urban economics, the Chinese leader fell into the trap prepared by his enemies. The result was catastrophic. A fact, however, is worth noting. At the start of the 1960s, a figure in the Kennedy administration, Walter W. Rostow, bragged about the triumph of the United States, which could slow the economic development of China by quote decades. And so the terrifying famine that followed the Great Leap Forward was put on the ledger of the presumed homicidal rage of Mao, rather than on the Machiavellian policy pursued by Washington. Yeah, I mean, it's like they come right out and not only say that their plan is to do this, they enact that very plan, and then they brag about having done that plan. But then they blame, of course, China for their plan having worked. In conclusion, Margolin, Schmidt, and Kissinger are at fault for not fully placing the disastrous utopian experiment of Mao in the historical context of the colonial tragedy that opened with the Opium Wars and was still going on in the years of the Great Leap Forward. Instead, Zizek, by removing the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism and Mao's troubled race to escape from the desperate mass misery that had resulted from colonial aggression and domination, puts it all on the ledger of the homicidal folly of the Chinese leader. Yeah. Yep. It's very cute and fun the way that they perpetrate these things and then just say that socialism has failed. So section 3 here, Harvey and the absolutization of inter-imperialist rivalry. Okay. Openly vilified by Zizek, the anti-colonial revolution is entirely absent from the work of David Harvey, another exponent of Western Marxism. The picture he paints, starting with the contradictions of capitalism from the mid-20th century on, is eloquent testimony. Quote, "The overall result, as Lenin so accurately predicted, was 50 years of inter-imperialist rivalry and war in which rival nationalisms featured large. Can the great historical crisis that broke out in 1914 and came to a provisional resolution in the defeat of the Third Reich be characterized only by the conflict between opposing imperialist powers? Was the war that saw the quote indigenous people of Eastern Europe strenuously resist Hitler's attempt to subjugate and enslave them as inter-imperialist war? Like the Great Patriotic War, Harvey also ignores the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese imperialism, not to mention the quote minor national wars of resistance in Yugoslavia, Albania, France, and Italy that accompanied the Second World War and contributed to the defeat of the Third Reich. The only conflict Harvey refers to is, quote, inter-imperialist rivalry and war." That's wild because that's like legit how Western Marxists think about it today. Like they just see the U.S. starting and waging these proxy wars all over the place, um, assisting genocidal regimes like Israel, and they just think all of it is just imperialism. They think when Russia resists that imperialism, that's just competing imperialism. When China does anything at all, that's a competing imperialism. It's not anti-imperialism. There's only just imperialism. Harvey wrongly cites Lenin, yeah, just like the Western Marxists. Harvey wrongly cites Lenin, whom we have seen in 1916 evoke national wars not only in the colonial world, but in the heart of Europe itself, anticipating the scenario that would happen a little more than 2 decades later. The British Marxist scholar instead reads the Second World War according to a scheme that we have come to know. You go from the Great Depression to the explosion of, quote, inter-imperialist rivalries. In other words, to overcome the devastating economic crisis that broke out in 1929, quote, it took the travails of war between capitalist states. But how do we explain the fact that Hitler came to power posing as a champion of the cause of white supremacy in Europe and the world? He was quite aware that, inspired by the appeal by Lenin in the October Revolution to the quote slaves of the colonies to break their chains, the world anti-colonialist revolution had begun. It was a question of containing it and pushing it back by any and every means. Yeah, that's literally exactly why they're resurrecting Hitler. That's why they're revering him again. It's because we are at another inflection point of anti-colonialist revolution, and they do not want to see that shit happening. They are actually threatened by that. Nothing threatens the U.S. more than a multipolar world right now. It is this anti-colonialist revolution that Harvey ignores when he looks at both past and present. To be precise, as far as the present is concerned, there is a particular discrepancy. When he analyzes the conflicts of our own time, the British Marxist scholar describes them correctly. But when drawing conclusions, he subsumes under the category of inter-imperialist rivalry and war contradictions and processes that are quite different. Harvey emphasizes the role of the United States in the coup d'etat in Chile in 1973 that overthrew Allende and in Venezuela in 2002, which for a brief time overthrew and imprisoned Hugo Chavez. In both cases, Harvey does not hide his sympathy for the popular resistance against imperialist aggression. Unfortunately, he does not ask what kind of contradiction existed between Chile and Venezuela on the one hand and the United States on the other. And having analyzed correctly the relations between Washington and Beijing, he poses no questions either. We read, the United States wants, quote, the power to cut off the oil flow to its opponents, in general, and China in particular. The United States is not disposed to peacefully resign itself to the shift shift pushing the center of the world economy toward East Asia. It feels a strong temptation to use its military power to maintain its shaky hegemony. What did I just say? Nothing threatens the U.S. more than the idea of a multipolar world. They cannot fucking stand that. It is like an existential level crisis for U.S. hegemony. In sum, it is tending, quote, to make the transition from informal to formal empire. Yeah, it's all getting more explicit, as we see. According to the British scholar, the Chinese leadership seems fully aware of all this. The economic reforms introduced in 1979 serve, quote, to upgrade its technological capacities and, quote, to better defend itself against external aggression. Staying with this description, it is a question of measures that also constitute an insurance policy against imperialist projects hatched by the great powers responsible for having imposed, quote, a century of humiliation on a fifth or a fourth of the population of the world through colonial or semi-colonial oppression. But from the general picture painted by the exponent of Western Marxism, there emerges a very different conclusion. In passing from the 20th century to the 21st century, quote, echoes of the geopolitical competition that became so destructive in the 1930s begin to be heard. We risk, quote, a return to Lenin's scenario of violent competition between capitalist power blocks. Yeah, they're all just capitalist power blocks, even the ones run by communists. So weird. History is the repetition of identity. It is the repetition of identity. It is the eternal rivalry between capitalist and imperialist powers. The cautionary warning by Lenin that the British Marxist scholar ignores comes to mind. One cannot adequately understand imperialism if one loses sight of, quote, the enormous importance of the national question. Yeah. Yep. I think I'm at 40 minutes. Let me check here. Oh, yeah, I'm pretty close. Like 39, 30. So tomorrow we will pick up on this book in section 4 titled If Only Badu Had Read Togliatti. It's funny because reading this book also makes me just kind of question. Like, I really like the podcast Why Theory. It's like one of my favorite ones to listen to. It's just like some podcasts are just like they're I don't know. It's just like something about their production. It's just like what do you call it? It's like the vibe of like lo-fi music to study to. It's just very chill. So their podcast is very chill and just easy to listen to. But it just makes me question like because they reference Badu a lot. They love Zizek. They're like personal friends with him. Makes me wonder if they are just part of these Western Marxists they're describing. I mean, they talk enough about voting for Kamala that it's safe to say they're kind of lib. Sorry guys, I still love your show. All right, so now we're gonna switch over to the third book. This is The Soviets Expected It by Louise Strong. So picking up again, talking about life in Soviet USSR, Russia, and other countries just before and during World War II. Before the present war, the Red Army had had practical experience in three conflicts. In 1938, the Japanese attacked at Changkufeng in the Far East and were beaten. In 1939, they tried again at Nomonhan, near the border of Outer Mongolia, and were broadly routed or badly routed after a conflict of several months. In 1939 to 40, they recurred the war in Finland, carried on by the Leningrad Military District. Immediately after all these conflicts, leading officers engaged in them went to the Soviet military academies as teachers to share their experience. The same thing is occurring during the present Soviet German war. Officers from the front who have learned the latest tactics of the enemy spend their periods of rest giving instruction to other officers who have not yet taken the field. Okay. So it's iterative the way that it should be. Like that's often like one of my biggest criticisms of like the Western leftist quote unquote movement such as it exists is that it is not iterative. It is not reflecting upon itself and then adapting based on the conditions or based on its successes or failures. It's just repeating the same mutual aid and protest tactics over and over again and expecting different results, while the capitalists and the state, in conjunction, are quite obviously and very quickly updating and adapting their own tactics. So, quote, for the first time, said Major George Fielding Eliot, quote, the Germans have been met by an army trained not for the war of 1918, but for the war of 1941. This is from, I guess, the New York Herald Tribune, July 29th, 1941. So we're on to Chapter 7, The Army and the People. The tremendous manpower of the Red Army is conceded by everyone. In the First World War, Imperial Russia mobilized 15 million men. On the same basis, with its increased population, the USSR could put 20 million in the field. The 1939 census showed 22 million men between the ages of 20 and 39. A larger proportion of these can be used for the army than in any other countries because so many Soviet women have been trained to take men's places in field and factory. In the 15 years since the reorganization of the Red Army, some 11 million have received military training either in the regular army or the territorial units. 5 or 6 million have had very recent and thorough training and may be called the actual spearhead of the war. The quality of this manpower, both in body, brain, and spirit, has markedly changed since Tsarist days. Socialized medicine and hygiene and the care given to mothers and at childbirth, physical education and sport among young people, and the steady increase in the national standard of living are all factors that have improved the national health. Army statistics have shown a steady increase in the weight, height, and chest measurements of the average recruit. In 6 years, average weight increased 4 pounds, height nearly half an inch, and chest measurement more than an inch. By 1936, the increase in physical development made it possible to change the draft age from 21 to 19 years, thus enabling young men to complete their military service before marriage and before embarking on their careers. The Moscow military district had only 0.4% rejections of recruits in 1940 for reasons of defective health. So now, of course, if you were to interpret those statistics from a Western lens, you would say, look, they lowered their recruitment age and their rejections are so low. So they're really desperate. Really no way to know. You can look at it from both sides, but judging by who won the war, I would say, of course, I'm going to be sympathetic to the Soviets here. But I also just think it's interesting to talk about the difference in like the morale of the soldiers. It's like it almost goes without saying, like people don't talk about war in these terms anymore. There is not like this league of their own kind of thing where all the men go off such that women have to take all these jobs that were typically male roles. Like even when the US has been embroiled in wars for my entire life, anyone's entire life listening to this, you don't see this kind of like lack of citizens in like civilian roles. And why is that? Is that we just have like that many more people that we don't need that? They've just beefed up the military so much, like the standing army so much that like it's just not necessary anymore. Um, or is it just that people don't feel patriotic enough to bother caring about anything on that like national scale anymore? Obviously, it's a combination of all these, but it's just interesting. And then it makes me wonder, because of course that's how the U.S. would portray it, that it's still going on like that in Russia. Like they are actually lacking so many people. Like I still get people on Blue Sky, like liberals, telling me that Russia has lost 1 million people in this war that was supposed to last 3 days. It's like, but if you believe that, I have some, uh, I have some wild opportunities and NFTs for you. The education and military knowledge of the new recruits have also increased from year to year. In early days, the Red Army had the nickname, quote, the Peasants' University, because the revolutionary armies taught reading and writing between intervals of fighting to the hordes of illiterate peasants who entered their ranks. As the Soviet Union progressed and newer recruits entered with higher levels of education, the army continued to provide them with courses in tractor driving, bookkeeping, engineering, and the many pursuits useful to both to a modern army and for civil life. A high degree of proficiency in many Army activities is attained by the new recruits even before they enter the Army. This is largely due to the tremendous development of athletics, especially to the activities of the Voluntary Civil Defense Society, known as the Osoaviakim. This tongue twister is a condensation of Society for Assistance in Defense and in Aviation Chemical Construction. Hmm. Organized in 1927 by the combining of two previous societies, it had some 10 million members when the Soviet German War began. To all of these, the society gives practical first steps in modern methods of defense. That's pretty cool. So, Osoa Viakim. Hmm. In its earlier days, the chief emphasis of the Osoa Viakim was on the development of all round physical fitness. Its symbol, the GTO badge, Ready for Labor and Defense, was awarded to persons who passed certain standards in walking, running, swimming, rowing, skiing, jumping, and every kind of summer and winter sport. By January 1st, 1939, there were almost 6 million holders of this badge, and a second degree of GTO requiring high diving, parachute jumping, and other difficult tests had been won by 71,000 people. In all of Tsarist Russia, there were only 30,000 members of all sport and athletic clubs combined. Yeah, they were just too oppressed to even have that kind of shit. All over the country, people and large numbers of older people go in for every variety of sport. That's another thing that just, I think, just doesn't get rid, like the way that like so many other countries in Eastern Europe and former Soviet countries still have this like level of like national pride in their sports, whereas like in the West, it's obviously so commercialized. People are constantly crowing about like why their favorite football team or favorite sports club or whatever is going to shit because it got bought up by private equity or some like foreign investors that are like ruining it. It's like, okay, catch on to the pattern, like figure it out. In the annual sports parades in Moscow and other cities, the young physical culturists march past in millions, dancing, cycling, marching, pyramiding, and even playing basketball and volleyball on the march. On these occasions, various athletic clubs boast of their prowess. Young communists of the Red Dawn telephone factory, for instance, hiked 5,400 miles to the Mongolian border in 180 days. Another group announced its return from climbing to the Altai Mountains, covering 1,200 miles on foot. One of the most spectacular events was the Baikal Murmansk ski run across half Asia and half Northern Europe in the depths of winter. Hmm. These all sound like really intense, especially for like this time period where they didn't have like, the kind of cool, efficient coats we have now. Another was a mass climb of Mount Elbrus, an 18,465-foot mountain, some 4,000 feet higher than Mont Blanc or Mount Rainier, made by several hundred Caucasian peasants under the under the personal leadership of Kalmykov, the president of the Kabardenia-Balkarian Republic. The climb was incidentally a spectacular attack on, quote, religion, for local belief held that the demons would get you if you invaded the upper slopes. Oh, I guess maybe some Yeti or something. That's cool. Parachute jumping has become a national sport in the Soviet Union. Damn, they were into like extreme sports. They were like the X Games before it was. Well, I'm not even gonna say it was cool. Soviet people are probably the most air-minded people in the world. Training for air-mindedness begins in the kindergarten. Small tots play the quote butterfly game and jump around with large butterflies pinned on their hair, gaining the idea that flying is fun and a natural activity. Children in their teens make jumps from quote parachute towers, which are far rougher and more realistic than the parachute tower in the New York World's Fair, which was copied from them. The sport is popular not only in the cities but on the farms. Several years ago, a Ukrainian farmer told me of his trip to the nearby city with a group of farm children, all of whom immediately formed in line in the recreation park to go up in a tall tower and jump off under a parachute. Quote, I thought it was very terrifying, he said, and wondered why the park authorities allowed it. Then I saw that my own 13-year-old daughter was at the head of the line. These children of today aren't afraid of anything. These kids today, I guess. At an older age, Soviet young people jumped from airplanes, learned to operate gliders, or even become amateur pilots in their spare time. Every large factory, government department, and many of the larger collective farms have, quote, aviation clubs, which are given free instruction by the government. Probably 1 million people in the Soviet Union have made actual jumps from parachutes. It is not surprising that the Red Army was the first to use parachute troops in active service several years before the Germans adopted them. In 1931, a small detachment of parachutists surrounded and cleaned up a bandit gang in Central Asia. The making of airplane models by young people is taken seriously in the USSR. In 1937, over 1 million schoolchildren were spending after-school hours in aviation model stations. At a later stage, young people of talent create real airplanes and demonstrate them at Tushino aviation exhibitions. Owing to the wide interest in aviation and the public ownership of the factories, a bright Soviet youth who invents a new type of airplane may get it constructed by his factory sports club and show it off. At one of the aviation festivals I attended, I saw a score of different amateur planes, including every possible shape of flying object: short, stubby ones, long, thin ones, others shaped like different kinds of insects. They added greatly to the gaiety of the occasion. Whether or not they produced any really valuable new invention, they at least encouraged the inventiveness of their makers. Yeah, they're just making shit just for the fun of it. That's pretty cool though. When you have like that level of creativity and innovation like subsidized publicly, and you give people the ability to do that kind of thing. Once again, only under communism, folks. By the time the Second World War began, the Osoaviakin had trained its younger members that had so trained its younger members that when Moscow and Leningrad youth were called up for Red Army training, over 60% of them were found to be, quote, Voroshilov sharpshooters, having already passed tests in straight shooting and cleaning and caring for weapons. Over 600 in each city held the far higher title of, quote, sniper, implying an unusual degree of skill. Soviet sniping is so good that in London in 1937, the USSR took first place among 212 teams from 28 countries in the international small caliber shooting competition. The following year, teams from the USSR won all the first 6 places. In 1939, a shooting contest was carried on by correspondence with the British Association of Miniature Rifle Clubs. Okay, so I guess they shoot at their respective locations and then send off the stats. The Soviet teams won 18 out of the first 21 places. Besides this training given to young people, the Osoaviakim has popularized military knowledge among the older population to the point where millions of men, women, and even children can put on a gas mask, clear out bombed debris, extinguish fires, give first aid to victims of bombs or poison gas, throw hand grenades, operate telephonic, radio, and telegraphic communications, and other activities. In the past 2 years especially, all this training has been given a very realistic turn. Study groups in field and factory learned how to shoot, camouflage themselves, advance, hurdle obstacles, entrench themselves, fight hand to hand, and throw grenades. These study groups then united into detachments, moved into the fields, and practiced their skill in joint maneuvers. They were literally doing like public, state enforced and state funded, what do you call it, like state subsidized gladio shit. Like exactly the kind of like, not even stay behind, but just live here organizations that Gladio was availing itself of to fight communists, to assassinate and take out whoever they didn't like. That's the kind of orgs they had, like people who were just like militant, heavily trained and armed people who knew exactly what to do. Like this is crazy stuff. Sorry, I just realized I was not sharing to the correct tab. So I've now switched over to the book. You can follow along. My bad, folks. Only a month before the Germans attacked the Soviet borders, 7,000 Moscow citizens practiced a special drill in repulsing parachute troops over the weekend. The large numbers of such trained citizenry, both among recruits entering the Red Army and among the older citizens assisting it, greatly add to the Soviet Union's total defense. Millions of trained women further strengthen the defense of the country. Not only do they replace men in the civilian jobs, but hundreds of thousands of them are in the full-time services of the Red Army. They are not drafted, and they are not ordinarily permitted in the combat services. The famous, quote, Red Amazons and the death battalions are fiction, not fact. But the Army Medical Service is full of women. 60% of all Soviet doctors and surgeons are women. The profession might also be called might almost be called women's work. There are also many women in army supply and communications and engineers. One-third of the Russian engineering profession are women. Thousands of women are airplane pilots. In the Red Air Fleet, they fly ambulance planes and transports and act as air instructors teaching men. They are not allowed to fly bombers or fighters. When they begged for this right in the name of equality, Voroshilov told them, quote, "The terrible shock of combat is bad for the health of future mothers." In the final emergency, women pilots are part of an air reserve of some 200,000 pilots, the largest air reserve in the world. So I guess they train them, but they're just still not going to use them until it's like a last resort. It's crazy what you can do. And again, you don't rely on the private sector and people going into debt to be able to educate themselves in any of the technical aspects that might be good for your nation in peacetime or war. Let's see, how much longer should I go here? Oh yeah, I'll go for like 5 more minutes. So while not in the regular combat services, women often fight when emergency calls. They enter the Osowa Viakim on an equality with men. Millions of them have learned to shoot. The first shock of the German invasion fell on the frontier guards who were living on the border with their families. Their women at once shared in the fighting, not so much by shooting as by handling telegraph and telephone and transporting supplies to the men. Valentina Plunch, a young woman who had just graduated from the medical university when the war began, went to the front as battalion surgeon. When her battalion was encircled and its commander wounded, she took command and led the battalion out of the encirclement to safety, after which she resumed her normal task of caring for the wounded. The years that Soviet young men spend in the army do not separate them from normal civil life. Not only do they receive considerable general education, but they are frequently called upon for special civilian tasks. They continue to exercise the right to vote and to be elected, which with Soviet citizens starts at the age of 18. Every army unit is affiliated directly with some large civilian organization, usually a big factory, known as its, quote, sponsor. The sponsoring factory gives the Army unit equipment for its leisure time activities, while the Army unit supplies the factory with instructors and military training. Frequently, the Army's regular work is correlated with some task of civilian construction. The Red Army, for instance, gave spectacular aid to the city of Kharkov during the building of that city's tractor plant. In the days of farm collectivization, when the growth of collectives far outran the supply of tractors, Kharkov, a Ukrainian city of considerable civic pride, decided to build a tractor plant of its own. This was a stupendous task, for the 5-year plan had already allocated every machine, every bag of cement, and almost every nail and piece of glass, and Kharkov had to be built, quote, outside the plan, or had to build, quote, outside the plan. The city challenged this almost insuperable difficulty, secured equipment by calling upon patriotic Ukrainians to produce surpluses, quote, above the plan in their factories, and overcame the shortage of unskilled labor by inducing the whole population of Kharkov, office by office and factory by factory, to donate a holiday or two each month to hauling dirt or laying floors. As the plant neared completion, an emergency appeared with which no civilian could help cope. A trench 7 kilometers long and a meter deep was needed to bring the plant's water supply. Kharkov asked for the help of the Red Army, which sent on the appointed day a detachment of 7,000 men equipped with trenching tools. They took up their positions along the whole 7-kilometer line, 1 man to each meter. Each dug 1 cubic meter, his share of the trench, thus completing the entire 7,000-meter ditch by the end of the day. It was normal military trench work correlated with a civil emergency. It's pretty cool. Again, what centralized social government planning can achieve when you just allow that to happen, when you allow that to be a central force of your infrastructure, of the development of your country, you can accomplish a lot of cool things. Like imagine an Amish barn raising, how they can get that shit done in a day, but imagine that as like your state policy. The famous, quote, Grasshopper War of 1927 in Soviet Central Asia was a far bigger achievement than the Kharkov Trench. It was a fight of the peasants, led by the Red Army, to save the cotton fields. Great clouds of locusts, a mile deep and tens of miles long, came flying over the Afghan border into Soviet Turkestan. The regional government mobilized the whole population to fight the pests and called upon the army to help. Army airplanes scouted the skies to note where the invaders landed. The army supplied chemicals to poison the newly hatched larvae. When the grasshoppers began to move, the people, under army leadership, dug trenches scores of miles long and reinforced at the far side by sheets of steel sloping toward the invaders. When the hoppers fell by the billions into the trenches, they were burned by flamethrowers that the army had supplied. It was a striking but typical example of the organized cooperation of the army and people. So yeah, I'll bookmark this one here. That's like, I guess, kind of like Mao's war on sparrows, but successful. He still gets made. I just saw that meme again like yesterday, where it's like the sparrow saying, like Mao says sparrows must go, and then it's a little sparrow says who must go, and then it's like Mao in his gravesite like on display, and there's like a sparrow dunking on him. Funny stuff, you guys. All right, this will be the reading hour for August 5th. Thank you guys again for joining. Appreciate you guys hanging out in chat. Put this out on the podcast feed again. Subscribe to True Crimes of the Empire podcast on any podcast app if you want to hear the audio versions of these. I have them releasing every 3 days, so go and check it out there.